The world woke up to a serious fuck up at sea that is sparking new geopolitical drama between the United States and Russia, and it's not some distant bullshit that only diplomats care about. U.S. forces have seized a Russian flagged oil tanker called Marinera in the North Atlantic after a long chase that spanned weeks and pulled in warships, reconnaissance aircraft, and high end military assets. And now Washington and Moscow are yelling at each other like kids in a schoolyard about whose turn it is to own the sandbox. The U.S. says the tanker violated sanctions tied to Venezuela and is enforcing international law according to its own courts. But Russia calls the move illegal, a blatant breach of maritime law, and even straight up piracy. The clash has already caused a shitstorm of diplomatic protests, threats, and military posturing that could ripple out into broader tension across global shipping lanes and alliances. The whole mess started when the U.S. identified the Marinera, previously named Bella 1, as part of a network of vessels suspected of moving sanctioned Venezuelan and Iranian oil around the world to keep regimes afloat, despite heavy Western sanctions. After failing to board the ship in the Caribbean last month, the crew slapped a Russian flag on the hull and changed its name, hoping to bullshit their way out of trouble by claiming Russian jurisdiction. U.S. forces continued to track the ship across the Atlantic, eventually boarding and seizing it in international waters under a warrant from a U.S. federal court. U.S. officials argue they're simply enforcing sanctions that are meant to weaken regimes that flout global norms, protect rule of law, and restrict illicit oil trafficking. Russia doesn't buy any of that and says Washington has no right to use force against a vessel flying its flag in open sea. That argument has Moscow's transport ministry screaming about violations of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and demanding humane treatment and immediate return of its crew, turning what should be a legal tug of war into full-blown political warfare. On the Russian side, the reaction has been intense. Officials have dispatched naval vessels and at least one submarine into the North Atlantic to escort or protect tankers that might be next, signaling they are ready to escalate if the U.S. keeps pushing. Russian leaders and lawmakers in Moscow have publicly denounced the seizure as state-sanctioned piracy and banditry, insinuating that the U.S. is acting like a global bully rather than a law-abiding power. They're also framing their naval movements as defensive, even though the mere presence of submarines in international waters chasing or shielding oil tankers is exactly the kind of militarized flex that gets everyone else nervous. On top of that, prior protests have been lodged over alleged violations of Russia's maritime borders by U.S. warships, and there have been reports of Russian warships challenging U.S. submarines near disputed islands, all of which feeds into a narrative of mutual distrust and increasing risk of dangerous run-ins at sea. From Washington's perspective, the hardline stance on sanction enforcement is part of a broader strategy to pressure just Russia, but allied regimes like Venezuela that have been trading oil with Tehran and Moscow under the radar. U.S. Secretary of Defense and other officials have pushed back hard on Kremlin claims, saying that reflagging vessels and playing dumb won't shield ships from accountability. Washington points to its legal framework and court orders as justification and insists that forces will continue to monitor and, if necessary, interdict vessels that threaten to undermine international sanctions regimes. This approach has already reshaped parts of the global energy market, and experts warn that continuing to tie maritime law enforcement so closely to unilateral sanctions could undermine the stability of international maritime norms in the long run. It's not just about one tanker or one chase either. Analysts say what's happening reflects deeper structural shifts in how major powers project power on the seas. Russia's expanded naval activity in the Baltic and North Atlantic, along with near-weekly submarine encounters reported by countries like Sweden, shows Moscow isn't shy about pushing its maritime presence into contested waters. NATO allies have bumped up surveillance and patrols, intercepting Russian corvettes and tankers in strategic choke points like the English Channel, and deploying surveillance aircraft near Iceland and the Arctic. Meanwhile, U.S. naval investments, including forward deployments and frequent freedom of navigation operations, signal that Washington is prepared to counter Moscow's moves far from U.S. shores. These aren't random brush-ups. They're part of a larger chess game where everyone's trying to signal strength without triggering a full-blown war. At the same time, there's a balancing act between showing resolve and avoiding outright conflict. U.S. officials insist their actions are lawful and targeted, but Russia's escalation raises the risk that even routine interdictions could spiral into violent confrontations if miscalculations happen. The maritime disputes overlap with other flashpoints, like disagreements over Arctic shipping routes, Russia's larger military involvement in Ukraine, and the tangled alliances with other regional actors like Venezuela. As these tensions mount, the potential for accidents, ships colliding, submarines lurking too close to each other, or miscommunications at sea, increases. History is full of moments where naval incidents that started small turned into bigger crises, and many experts warn that the current climate could become combustible if diplomatic channels aren't opened wide and fast. Economically, the tension is already biting. Global shipping markets are jittery because the specter of US-Russia naval shows of force threatens insurance costs, rerouted tankers, and greater risk premiums for carriers that have to pass through contested zones. Energy markets feel it too, with prices fluctuating as traders guess at what comes next. Countries that rely on stable access to oil and gas are watching closely because disruptions in maritime supply chains, especially those involving sanctioned oil, can reverberate through global prices and have knock-on effects on economies still reeling from pandemic shocks and inflationary pressures. Even non-aligned states are paying attention because the rules governing freedom of navigation and treaty obligations are supposed to be sacrosanct. And when they're challenged by unilateral enforcement, it sets a precedent that worries everybody. Diplomats from Europe and beyond are now scrambling to calm things down, urging both sides to engage in talks and seek clarity on how maritime law applies in these novel situations where sanctions and military enforcement collide. Russia's harsh rhetoric hasn't made that easier. Labeling U.S. actions as piracy is a dramatic phrase that has ratcheted up domestic pressure in Moscow to respond forcefully. Western governments, for their part, are trying to thread the needle of supporting the U.S. legal stance on sanctions, while also emphasizing the need to uphold international norms, making clear they aren't advocating for endless naval confrontations. It's a tightrope walk because every statement gets parsed and every naval movement gets interpreted as a threat or a provocation, depending on who's watching. So, for someone just catching this news without any backstory, here's the bottom line. A U.S. military operation seized a Russian-flagged oil tanker in the middle of the ocean for alleged sanction breaches. Russia is furious and calling it theft and piracy. Both sides are moving warships and subs around like pieces on a board, and diplomats are scrambling to prevent this from turning into something much uglier. This isn't a small regional spat. It's a major test of how much leverage the U.S. will exert on maritime trade routes, though how far Russia is prepared to push back, and how international law is interpreted when global superpowers butt heads. Every ship crossing the Atlantic or cruising near contested waters now has a cloud of uncertainty hanging over it, and that has implications for economies, energy security, and the stability of international rules that have kept relative peace on the seas for decades. If you want straight, no bullshit updates on this developing story and other big geopolitical clashes that matter to you, make sure you hit subscribe and stay tuned. I'm Kelvin, and I'm the producer bringing you this report.